racism and to think about our collective work in the Academy is why we're here. On behalf of the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, I bid you greetings and do so on behalf of our president, Paulette Granberry Russell. Our mission as an institution is to lead higher education toward inclusive excellence through institutional transformation. NADAHE seeks to serve as the preeminent voice for diversity officers in higher education by supporting our collective efforts in empowering diversity officers to produce and disseminate empirical evidence through research and to inform diversity initiatives, to identify and circulate exemplary practices, to provide ongoing professional development for current and aspiring diversity officers, to inform and influence national and local policies, and to create and foster networks of opportunity to advance and move this work forward. Certainly, this is one of those opportunities as we think about collective effort to move this work forward. As was shared, I serve as the second vice president for NADAHE, and in my day role, I serve as the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion at the University of Pittsburgh. I also send greetings on behalf of my colleagues at Pitt and look forward to the full discussion today. As we think about being here and how we work proactively to address this work, I reflect on my own experiences, having served as a diversity officer at a large Research One public institution, having served in that role for a large state system of higher education, having done so at a private residential institution, and having done so at a community college system. I'm reminded that there are commonalities in how we confront and work to address racism in our community, in the academy, and how collectively as colleagues, we have to pull our work together. Certainly part of this is about our ongoing education and awareness and understanding that as facilitators and partners in change, we have to be mindful of the roles of how we impact systems, structures, and indeed individuals. During our time today, I'll talk more about the competency development that I see as an imperative to help us move our work forward. So to be anti-racist and to advance our work collectively is to think about how we're supporting in an ongoing way anti-racist policies, and more importantly, actions that express who we are as individuals and who our institutions aspire to be. We can't escape the reality of the unrest that came after the killing of Mr. Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and to think about how we have a responsibility to act now. As we are in the midst of a pandemic, our eyes have been constantly affixed to social media, our televisions, and engaging with our colleagues to think about how we can take actions on behalf of our students, how we can work to create new opportunities of exchange that will empower our institutions to be better. So as we think about anti-racism, as we think about our work, it's about building collective actions against policies, collective actions that empower and resource how we move this work forward. We think about the ongoing relationships as colleagues and open door access to inform, support our presidents, our boards as they make decisions. We think about how we must, in an ongoing way, provide platform to help educate and support our faculty and listen to the voices of our students. This is about bringing all of those synergies and strategies together to work effectively across different backgrounds, across different perspectives, to make sure that there is a common understanding for the foundational work that is required to move this work forward. So when we think about racism, we have to construct the idea that it's an advantage or systems that are predicated on how race has been assembled. The idea that the system of oppression in this country was based and founded upon race, that there are social and institutional power structures that are also connected to racial prejudice that lead to the system that impacts all of the experiences that we have. To acknowledge those things is to begin the foundational understanding of how we can move this work forward. As we think about that definition, as we think about the conception of racism, we understand that in different ways, it has different impacts on different communities. So as advocates of this work, we have to, in an ongoing way, examining not only the impact on individuals, but the impact on structures and systems. And in the conversation today, of course, we'll reflect on those things. So it's more than mere prejudice and how it manifests itself. It's us aggressively thinking about how we work to examine the systems that make up our institutions and the academy to help move us to a better place. Certainly, as we think about how race impacts and shapes our experience, we have to look at where those experiences come together. Certainly, part of it is how we experience our institutions, how we experience the individual units and departments that we're a part of, our teams, and also thinking about that impacts our community as well. So colleague to colleague interactions, colleagues interacting with our students, the interactions in the community all form a system that we must confront if we are to become more anti-racist and if we're going to move towards becoming anti-racist places overall. In terms of primary areas of consideration or that we want to put focus and attention on, I want us to think and understand that there is a historical context associated with each institution, no matter where we are. The history associated with your institution, the context for which we find ourselves in, at all times impact this work. Dr. Pribanow will queue up and talk more about the experience, obviously, at his institution. And as someone who has done this work in the role of a diversity officer and also supported the work as a consultant and to help add to the scholarly body that examines this work, we have to understand there are certain focus areas that we have to pay attention to. Certainly part of that is the individual cultural humility, cultural dexterity and flexibility that we have to advance in ourselves and awaken. How we engage with each other and understand that the dynamics that we laid out are factors. But also is the area of importance of understanding that as an academy, there are certain areas that we have to put particular attention on. I'll highlight some of those and we'll get into later how we might aggressively think as colleagues and how we support our presidents and allow a platform for diversity officers to impact how we make our places and spaces more anti-racist. We begin with the importance of looking at curriculum and pedagogy. Certainly as higher education institutions, we understand that it's the teaching and learning that makes our institutions the great pillars of excellence that they are. To be anti-racist in our actions means that we have to examine the curriculum and how it impacts the various students, to think not only about learning style, but the content in curriculum and how we make it more anti-racist, working directly with our faculty to adjust and move change. That is directly appended and tied to our work in thinking about academic equity. We are, of course, connected with teaching and learning and ultimately student success. How we make our institutions more inclusive in terms of environment, but in the context of the classroom setting, and we think about this conversation about the academic components of our institutions, how we prioritize academic equity, and to be transparent in examining the outcomes as it relates to our students and how race is a factor. And we have to prioritize that those outcomes, no matter the racial background of our students, should be equitable. So if our students of Black or other communities of color or indigenous communities experience different academic outcomes, how we're making adjustment to review those experiences is critical in how we become anti-racist institutions. Certainly part of that conversation is about institutional structure and thinking about how our institutions are positioned to advance this work. Certainly as a diversity officer, I challenge our institutions to think about how we give voice to the roles of CDOs, how we give voice to the work around anti-racism and prioritize it and position it in such a way that it has the appropriate level of attention, the appropriate level of resource, and so that we're prioritizing it as a pillar in all that we do. If this is a singular initiative and not in an ongoing focus area, and I'm sure Dr. Pribanow will talk more about this, in the work that you do with your faculty, your staff, your students, in your policy and procedure, we can't move this work forward. So institutional structure, how we're positioning power is going to be a critical factor in the work. We highlight the importance of us thinking about policies and policy development and utilizing a, a racial lens, specifically an equity lens, and not shying away from anti-Black racism being a factor in terms of how policies impact and guide how institutions shape the experiences of students, of their employees, is also included in the conversation about how we become more anti-racist. We think about the importance of training and employee development. Certainly, a number of institutions have began the process of exploring anti-racism education and making it mandatory for all of their employees, certainly as a best practice to move this work forward. And one of the initiatives that NADAHE is currently working towards is a framework to support how institutions can be more anti-racism. More anti-racist, I should say. One of those pillars is the training and employee development that helps us move this work forward, and how we advance that in such a way so that there's a common understanding of our work. We also think about the importance of resource allocation and how resources are critical in how we commit and move this work forward. Of course, no conversation about how we could be anti-racist would not be full unless we had a conversation about the access to our institutions, and thinking about how, more specifically, we think about the populations who may be present and those who are underrepresented at our institutions, and how we have to pay attention to the racial composition of those individuals, and how policy or historical context may have been a factor as it relates to how they had an opportunity to get to our institutions. So overall, as we think about those pillars, and lastly, as we connect it to the compositional diversity of our staff and faculty, as well as the compositional diversity of our leadership makeup, we begin to think about the strategies that are required in terms of how we combat and move anti-racism forward. Certainly, as part of the conversation today, I'm excited about sharing other anecdotes and ideas, and look forward to your questions as we think about how we work together. Dr. Privenel, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks so much, Clyde. Just a great privilege to be here with all of you. I want to both honor the fact that these two great organizations have come together. To be transparent, Clyde and I have a relationship that has started this year because we've engaged Clyde and some of his colleagues in helping us to do mandatory anti-racist training here at Augsburg. And I want to make a shout out as well to my partner in this work here at Augsburg, Joanne Reek, who is our Vice President for Equity and Inclusion, and certainly anything that we've been able to accomplish over the past 15 years is in many ways linked to her good work in our midst. I want to just say a quick word about Augsburg because I'm going to present some slides, but primarily to just use Augsburg as sort of a case study of how the president does partner with a chief diversity officer, chief inclusion officer to move this forward, this work forward, and what's the unique role that a president's office can play in that regard. But maybe just a quick word about Augsburg. We are in our 151st year. We're located in the heart of Minneapolis in one of the most diverse zip codes in the country. It's called the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, where almost all of our neighbors are immigrants. We are about 2 miles away from where George Floyd was murdered back at the end of May. We are an institution that over the past 12 or 13 years has been on a journey where our student body now is majority BIPOC. Our entering classes for the last 3 years have been about 65% students of color, and so indigenous students. And so we have been on a journey with our students. And I think that for me is one of the most important things that I want to bring across is that we are listening to our students and to the lived experience that they're bringing to our institution. And we're saying, we need to respond to them. It's both about access, but it's also about success. And success for them is, in fact, an institution listening to them, learning to trust them as we help to both to educate them, but also to equip them for lives in democracy as they go forward. So I'm going to share my screen here quickly and just go through some slides that I've prepared that I hope will be helpful. And that is focused on really three broad areas that I think the President's Office has certainly some deep responsibility for. And the first of those is really the issue around governance and planning. A second then is around, just as Clyde rightly pointed to, a whole set of policies and practices that the President, at least in the President's Office, needs to be mindful of. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about, I think Clyde also referenced this, really the saga, if you will, of an institution, and interrogating that saga for the sake of finding in that saga both the resources that you need to become an anti-racist institution, but also those places where in fact there may be obstacles to becoming an anti-racist institution, and how you address those as a community. So first, a quick word about the role of a board of, in our case, a board of regents, a board of trustees. This is work that I'm so proud of. As I mentioned, we've been on this journey for many years, and back 4 or 5 years ago, our board of regents established a board-led equity task force. And I want to say that across the higher education sector, I know some of you are maybe in institutions where you in fact have now standing committees on equity inclusion in your board. We decided not to go that route. We're trying to integrate this commitment across all of the work of our board, all the different committees, but this task force allowed us to name the highest priorities. And so what we were able to do then was to bring together board, faculty, staff, students, as well as some alumni, and begin to put their imprint, if you will, on the critical importance of this work for Augsburg. And it goes back to our mission statement. Augsburg has had in its mission since 1989 a commitment to intentional diversity. Part of that comes out of our tradition as a Lutheran Christian institution. Some of it comes out of our location. Certainly there are historic threads there. But the truth is, the shift in our student body profile, which really started to live into that commitment to diversity, didn't start to happen until shortly after I arrived in 2006. And I don't take any credit for that. I just point out that sometimes you can have rhetoric around these commitments, and then at some point you need to begin to show what difference that makes across the entire institution. And we've seen that work now over the past 15 years. So the board established this task force, as I say, 3 or 4 years ago, and came out with this really bold statement, which I have here in front of you, is Augsburg equity commitment. This notion that what education is about, and that ultimately we live in a society and in a sector that in fact, has put lots of barriers in front of our students and their families to be able to fully realize the gifts they have. And so that last paragraph, a very bold statement on behalf of our board, recognizing that our democratic promise is compromised by systemic and systematic barriers to college access and completion. We're called to stand for equity in everything we do. And this is a very proudly promoted as our board's commitment. And then there were 4 recommendations that went with this. And this becomes important again, because these translate then into planning documents and ultimately into policy and practice. The first was including equity as a central part of our strategic plan. The second was embracing the challenges of the students who had come and become a part of our community, and creating the culturally relevant learning spaces and opportunities that build their agency. That is to be the kind of institution that our students deserve, that they call us to. And I think Clyde pointed to that in his focus on curriculum and pedagogy as one aspect of that. Third recommendation had to do with lifting up those in our midst who in fact are already providing equity leadership, both on campus and in the broader, and how do we support their leadership, their scholarship, and make them really resources to all of us as we go through this work. And then finally for us, it was also our commitment as an anchor institution to think about how this equity lens creates engagement and partnerships with other organizations, other communities that share our commitment. So not going to do this on our own. Our students need to know that we're engaged in the communities where they come from, building trustworthy relationships that take and share capacity going forward. So these 4 recommendations then really led to deep kind of commitment to this work that's in the midst of our strategic plan. And this is the high level version of that plan that was just passed just a little over a year ago. So you see that vision to be a new kind of urban student-centered university, educating our students as stewards of an inclusive democracy, engaged in their communities. And then you see the key change pathways right there at the top: equity, leadership, intercultural competence, and inclusive excellence. Naming it as a central part of who we are as an institution became critical to this leadership work we do. And then this gives us the basis upon which to integrate, push this work down into all aspects of what we do as an institution. And I think Clyde rightly again pointed to the fact that this has to be an institutional commitment. It has to be institution thinking. Yes, we have to do this personal work, and we are certainly committed to the personal work that has to be done, but this is also really about the way that it gets embedded throughout the organization. So what that has allowed us then to do is to take these recommendations that came out of the task force, see it positioned in the plan, and now to push it into what Joanne Reek has created for us, which is an equity and inclusion framework that in fact arrays all of our efforts within these four categories, these four recommendations that were made. And that kind of integrated plan with a website that is kind of dynamic and continues to be updated with a variety of things that people are working on to lift up the leaders in our midst, to think about what our students are asking of us in this work, has then led to creating that kind of integrated effort that is now being lived out in various policies and practices. And that really is what I want to just lift up just a few of the things that we're doing, and they won't be surprise to you, I don't think. Most of these are aspects of the work that's going on across our campuses and many of our locations. Certainly how we grow intercultural competence. We require all of our faculty and staff to take the IDI. We provide a variety of consulting then to help them to grow personally and developmental. As I mentioned earlier, we are now mandating an anti-racist training, a 7-hour training that they go, all faculty and staff. We have a very robust diversity and inclusion certificate program that at this point, a majority of our faculty and staff have gone through. That is a series of workshops that they take linked to the IDI. So that commitment to training and to professional development is central to what we're trying to do. We also support our students in a very specific way. So this is a brand new initiative that came out of the George Floyd tragedy, which has our key staff involved in our DEI work. There you see them now focused on how we can bring together scholarship support with kind of robust training and cohort building, calling it the Kente Village Fellowship here, but we're very, very much focused on how we are equipping our students to dismantle anti-Black racism, to think about what they are, how it's integrated into their educational experience here at Augsburg. And as you see a wide array of folks, you've got, again, Joanne together with Azania, who actually directs our Pan-African Center, Chris Dixon over in our athletic area, who's done a wonderful job with our student athletes, and then Kate Gray, who's in our, basically our career center. And so thinking about how this work, again, crosses all aspects of the student experience here at Augsburg. We also are involved in an ongoing commitment to really reviewing all policies and communications. One of the things I think you would certainly understand this, a lot of things get evergreened in our, if you will, in our policies and practice, they get carried forward. So how are you bringing an equity lens to asking questions? What is in this policy or this practice that is actually a function of white privilege? What is in this that is actually a function of, again, putting obstacles in front of our students? And I tell a quick story, which just for me really brought this home. This was back a couple, 3 years ago when somebody in my registrar's office came to me and said, we just heard from a student that she can't participate in commencement. And I said, well, why is that? She said, well, it's a Muslim, Somali Muslim student and a woman who said, well, I got the letter from you, registrar, saying that this is what's going to happen at commencement. So you will take your card to the dean will read your name, you'll go across the stage, you'll shake the hands of the president and the board chair, and then you'll get your picture taken. And when she read that, she said, well, I can't do that because I can't shake the hand of the president. That's not part of my tradition. And interestingly, of course, for so many years, we had been practicing the fact that when a Muslim woman student came across the stage, we wait for them to put their hand out or not. Good practice, we all know that. Well, in this case, we hadn't carried that practice into the way that we communicated to them, and we were actually creating an obstacle to her even participating in commencement. So just a simple example of how, even at the granular level, things that we have in place that really, in fact, get in the way. And you take this, you scale this up to even bigger levels, so bias and discrimination issues in hiring. So we've gone through a very extensive set of training for all of our faculty who are involved in faculty hiring to make sure that they understand the kinds of, both the ways that they write job descriptions, the kind of questions they ask, how wide their reach is in terms of building a pool, and all of that has become a central part of our work on the administrative side and trying to support that work as we go forward. And the final kind of broad area, and this one moves us off campus. I also believe that, in fact, this equity work needs to drive your work out in the community. So for us, That's been a whole variety of efforts. These are just a few. We have a Shop Local, of course, which is really around local businesses, which for us are many of our minority-owned, women-owned businesses. We have programs through our nursing program that are working with those experiencing homelessness. That is really a huge equity question. And then we are involved in food insecurity and housing insecurity work through programs like Soup for You, which provides free meals every day. So examples of outreach that we do, community engagement that we do that also is driven through an equity lens. And finally, let me just say a few words here about this idea of interrogating your institutional saga. So saga is a concept that was developed specifically for higher education by a fellow named Burton Clark back, I don't know, 4 or 5 decades ago. And his notion is that institutions have sagas, which aren't just a narrative history, but they're actually the various threads that have shaped who you are as an institution. And I think that, if we don't take the time to interrogate our sagas, we may find that there are threads that just continue, again, that have been brought through the entire history that actually become obstacles to our being the kind of anti-racist institutions we want to be. And I think presidents and presidents' offices bear a special responsibility for this aspect of the work. And so from my perspective, interrogating your institutional saga is about educating. It is about remembering that history. It's about appreciative inquiry, finding the resources that are going to be helpful, but also finding those, in fact, that you have to be accountable for, where there maybe needs to be some truth and reconciliation work. And finally, they are also about how that saga pushes you forward and becomes an intentional claiming, if you will, of a saga that will move you forward into your aspirations. And for Augsburg, this is particularly poignant. I said 151 years we've been around. We were founded by Northern Europeans, Norwegians. We are associated with the Lutheran Christian faith, which is the most white denomination in the United States. We have an academic mission that is grounded in the liberal arts, which of course, for in many cases is a kind of Western, white privilege academic tradition. And then we have a specific kind of role as a dominant institution in an immigrant neighborhood. That's about as white as you can get in terms of a saga, I would say. And for me, the key is how do we go back into that saga? And in fact, we're engaging this process right now with some philanthropic support. How do we go back into that saga and imagine, again, what's there that can help us to be accountable to how that white privilege has in fact gotten in the way of our aspirations, but also what's in that tradition, like in our faith tradition, a deep commitment to neighbor and to service. In our academic mission, a growing sense that we need to ask different questions with our students. So we've created a critical race and ethnic studies program that in fact will be launched here in next fall with 3 brand new faculty members brought specifically to start that program. We're making those commitments that really, I think, point to how that saga is going to lead us forward. So, so this would be a piece that I think in president's offices to think about what role you can play in this kind of interrogation of saga that may be some of the most fundamental work we have to do in understanding how institutions get in their own way, if you will, sometimes in this good work. So I will stop there and see if Clyde and I can engage in a little conversation, or we take questions. Or...
If I could, I want to just start by thanking you both. This has been a phenomenal. I gave you both impossible tasks, and you didn't blink an eye. So thank you. But what strikes me is, Paul, your institution is where we can hope most of our institutions are growing towards in terms of simply the enrollment, but also the perspective and the outlook and the strategy. But Clyde, you've worked at a number of institutions, and we're all at different places on this journey. And so I'm just wondering if you wouldn't mind responding to Paul's presentation with how that rubber can meet the road in a variety of different settings. Because as you mentioned, you've had a wonderful breadth of experience. So I'd like to begin with that, and we are getting some questions, and I'll get to those as soon as we can.
Absolutely, I appreciate the opportunity to do so. Certainly, I think when you acknowledge the work that President Pribenow and my colleague Joe Enrique are doing there, I think it's a pillar example in thinking about how you prioritize the work at the highest levels. So part of this conversation, particularly as we think about our relationships together, is how we set agenda together and work directly with our students. One of the things I'm most struck with with the work that's happening there is, in an ongoing way, having conversations with all stakeholder groups. So you'll hear him talk about the work that they're doing directly with their students, to listen to their perspective. The fact that they're investing time in thinking about what this means for their faculty and involving faculty in that process, but also thinking about this is something that involves our community as well. So in terms of thinking about where you are in the continuum of this work, and in terms of thinking about how we move this agenda forward, I'm struck by the importance of us thinking about messaging and being willing to be vulnerable as institution to move agenda forward, especially in the midst of the unrest that we just experienced, and the fact that we're in a pandemic and we're so held captive to this now. I can reflect on some of the work that we're doing here at the University of Pittsburgh, but we can't advance any of that forward if we're unwilling to take an active stance and say, we want to be an anti-racist institution. We want to be an institution that prioritizes equity. So to do that and to be vulnerable and to put yourself out there, I think is the first step to move that agenda forward. And I wanted to highlight that for our colleagues who are on this call, because I think as we think about the relationship between presidential assistants, and we think about the relationship with diversity officers and how we have counsel with our colleagues who are presidents, we have to set on the agenda for them the necessity to be vulnerable and to have ongoing communication with our universities and extended communities, that this commitment is an imperative.
As I expected, we're getting some great questions coming in. I just want to point out that if you can see the chat bar, I'm going to put in my email address in case you don't get to your question, then please follow up with me. But also note, when we get into some more specifics, that's what next week's conversations by institution type are all about, and you'll find a link to those in the chat bar. One of the first questions, and this kind of speaks to what we were just talking about regarding the diversity of institutions here represented. The notion of mandatory employee anti-racist training, or IDI certification, those sorts of things. There are going to be institutions who are part of this conversation right now who see that as a far-fetched dream. Could you give us some practical tips? I mean, we were saying before the call started, we consider it a boon that some of these restrictions on training are being removed, and that's a hopeful sign. But for institutions that don't have these kinds of trainings, what are some effective strategies for introducing them and gaining their acceptance? And I put that to both of you, please.
Well, I certainly have to take a quick lead in. And again, we have this now. Just I keep reminding you, this is 10, 12 years of work. So you start small, and we started small. So we introduced the IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory. We chose that particular instrument. There are others that are, I think, just fine, but we chose that one because, in fact, it is a developmental tool, and we felt that if used properly, it would be constructive and not judgmental, and that was key for us in terms of this starting this early. So we started small. We started with my leadership team. We started with offering it, voluntarily for folks that wanted to take it, and we built from there. And then when we reached a point, of course, where we felt that it was a critical aspect of our overall work, we could mandate it for staff. You can do that. We weren't in a similar situation that, probably with faculty. We had a lot of faculty taking it, but we weren't in a position necessarily to mandate it there. But what has happened is that slowly but surely, and part of this is just over 15 years, of course, a great chunk of the faculty has turned over. And so they come in eyes wide open about what we're trying to do, and they want to participate. So, that to me, I think is part of this. It's understanding along that journey that you may need to start with this, kind of pilot program and see it grow, because if your commitment as an institution becomes clear to people, you will both attract people who want to be a part of that, and people in the institution will start to see, I see why that's important, and they will then want to take advantage of the tools that you offer them.
Yeah, I echo those thoughts, absolutely. I think it's about picking a place to start. So I think depending on the institution, there are a number of tools and strategies that you can undertake to help move the development forward in the area. The IDI is a tool I'm familiar with based on my colleagues who used the tool in Minnesota. And when I was at the Minnesota State System, a number of our presidents used it with their executive teams. So that's a tool I'm familiar with. One of the things that I think that Dr. Pribenow shared that's so important is us understanding that we don't have to wait for all to start the work. I think it's important for us to pick a place to start the work. One of the things that we know, especially when we think about the re-energization or re-energizing, if you will, of student activism, they're asking us more about what our investment is in terms of training. Certainly that's true for the time that I've spent at the University of Pittsburgh. And we undertook as a senior leadership team an anti-racism retreat. So we spent 2 days spending time thinking about what this meant for us as a university, what it meant for us individually, and invested that time to continue to move that work forward. But it starts at a place. So thinking about how you can begin with your colleagues in having those initial conversations about what does anti-racism mean for our institution, and who are the points of contact that can help us move this forward. Certainly part of that conversation, would be to involve the diversity officer or the person who's strategizing that work and to empower them to help push the institution towards making the first steps in those journeys. The other thing that I would recommend as you think about that conversation is how in an ongoing way you have a feedback loop to assess what you're doing in terms of training. It's not enough for us just to start the process and say we did some form of training. It's to better understand, and the IDI is a tool that does this, get you an understanding to think about where you are on that continuum, and in an ongoing way, further inform and develop and move that work forward, and to do so at different places for our colleagues as it relates to their work.
Well, again, I'm indebted to you both. Clyde, you mentioned the necessity of being vulnerable, of putting yourself into vulnerable positions. And Paul, you mentioned how you started this with your leadership team. And I need to give a very big shout out to Augustana's incredible Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Dr. Monica Smith, who led the cabinet over the last summer. And like most cabinets, we were meeting on a very regular basis as we were plotting through pandemic. But she gave us a chance to walk together through the 1619 series from the New York Times. And as just one participant in that, I have to say it was transformative. It moved me on that spectrum, if you will. So I offer that as an idea because we're getting some questions about some specific ideas. And then, but here's another concrete one. We're hearing several questions on measurement. And Clyde, you mentioned IDI as a measurement tool. Are there some other ways that you measure the concrete impact of all the training you do? And I should say, Amanda Taylor offered that question for us.
So obviously, I think so. So when you get to more advanced places, you think about having equity audits in place for different academic units and the units across the institution, having an equity or diversity scorecard to think about the impact that you're having across the institution, and to think about very specific areas. So obviously, we're going to look at where we are in terms of the completion and success of our students. We're going to think about intentionally examining where we are in terms of hiring and retention of our employees, and specifically being willing to examine where we are with populations that we've not had success with. So in this case, being willing to call attention to anti-Black racism and how it may have been a factor in us having a small population of Black employees or Black students, for that matter, at our institution. So it's being willing to call attention to those things.
I might just offer a couple quick things. I think the IDI, the good thing about the way that we use the IDI, of course, is that you take the instrument on some kind of regular, every couple of 3 years or something, and it's about growing, over some period of time, developing. But if well kind of managed, it's about individuals building plans for themselves as well. And that's, I have my own IDI plan. And so I make a certain set of commitments, whether it's about reading or participating in different kinds of activities, all the things that I believe will help me to grow in my commitment to anti-racism. And so I think that's one piece of the puzzle we found really helpful. That particular model really works well. The other thing I would say is that we've built in this commitment to inclusion and equity into our performance evaluations. So for staff, they have a question actually in the instrument that says, how have you helped to advance Augsburg's commitment to equity inclusion? The provost has now built that in all sorts of ways that faculty report on their work. And again, there's no set way that we think that has to be done. People will find various ways to do it, but we want them to think about it and to understand it as an institutional commitment.
I'm glad you mentioned that. As we think about the assessment of experience I'm reminded of the importance of us thinking about at times how we put the undue burden on Black, Indigenous, and other groups of color to be the carriers of this work across the institution. It's an important perspective to think about how shared responsibility, particularly of our colleagues who are white, to be involved in these conversations, and more importantly, to be involved in the work. So thinking about the cultural taxation for many of our colleagues who are Black, Indigenous, and Latinx, et cetera, and what that means in terms of their work. So to call attention to that, I think is a priority. To include the work in performance evaluation, particularly as we think about what it means for senior leaders as well, to champion this work is a part of the conversation also.
We're getting several questions on this theme, so I'm going to distill them into one that was posed by Jana, and that is, what strategies might you offer for addressing the broad landscape on our campuses that ranges from "we are not doing enough" to I think we're doing an okay job, right? And remember that as president's assistants, and I love the saga language, for many of us, we are the keepers of sagas, right, for our institutions. How can we use that role? How can we leverage that role in speaking across that landscape? Any suggestions?
I would certainly add that seems to me there's another option, that is to those who think we shouldn't be doing it at all. So got to add that piece too, because if I had only people that in those two categories, I'd actually be pretty happy. So, no, but I do think that this again, from our perspective, was around how a narrative was unfolding here, and how people began to see themselves in that narrative was important. So part of my role was, in fact, to tell the story of our unfolding. And then, as others were willing to join that narrative, I remember a faculty member getting up once at an institution-wide kind of brown bag or something, and talking about how she had never really grappled with this idea of inclusive excellence. And she thought about her own training and her own socialization and what she demanded of her students. And when she brought that lens, all of a sudden she realized, wow, they're bringing gifts here that I don't have. And so how do I see excellence in them in a way that's different from what I might have defined as excellence before? Well, that was groundbreaking to have her join that conversation, distinguished, influential faculty member, now bringing other folks kind of into that way of thinking the work we do.
Absolutely. As my colleagues at NATAHE would share, that this is ongoing work. So there has to be an understanding that we have to be in an ongoing way committed to advancing this agenda forward. So that there are always going to be individuals who are in the various camps who may think that we may not want to invest in this work. We're as far as we need to be in this work, or we have more work to do, but to understand, how do we utilize the ongoing consultative structures that are in place to assess the work? So, of course, we advocate that there is a university-wide diversity, equity, inclusion council that examines the work, but to not restrict it to that place. I think as we think about the work of other committees and structures at the institution, how are we assessing their impact in investing time, effort, and attention to moving this work forward? One of the outcomes as part of the University of Pittsburgh responding to the demands of our students was to create some structures that address the gap. So specifically having the opportunity to respond to Black issues and the concerns of our students was something that we needed to amplify more. So as you think about how you move this work forward, it's being willing to amplify those voices in areas that might be underserved or underrepresented, and to say, we need to put some attention there and we need to move that agenda forward.
You're both inspiring me, and I'm sure that's happening for our audience as well. I'm going to take a spin on a question that came in earlier from an anonymous attendee. It says, we are balancing the important anti-racist work during a pandemic. How does a president's office manage the work while also addressing the immediate needs presented by the pandemic without having students feel alienated or like they aren't a priority? So any thoughts on that? But this woven together with some of our other thoughts, what I have noticed is that among my colleagues, the pandemic has shown up incredible inequities, right? Because it's played up the inequity in access to resources and access to healthcare and wealth and all kinds of things, right? So in a way, we speak in many of our circles of the twin pandemics, right? There's the pandemic that is public health, and there's the pandemic that is social health that we're seeing more and more clearly. And so I would posit that you take one and can use it as a lens to address those communities we talked about earlier, that they don't see it as much of a priority or an issue. but it's kind of hard to deny when the COVID pandemic is placing it in very stark relief. So I'm just wondering, and I know, Clyde, for your office, you've got unprecedented demands, I'm sure, as every single office on campus, from the bursar's office to registrar, related to the pandemic. How do you weave those things together? And then, Paul, I would ask the same of you.
Well, I think part of this conversation is being willing to amplify, as I talked about earlier, and prioritize those existing inequities. We know that they've been with us for some time. I'm reminded that when I helped to have conversations with NADAHE about this very matter, we hosted a webinar, and we were struck by how many of our colleagues around the country talked about that most of this work, most of the concerns that are being amplified now were already there. This has given us an opportunity to further prioritize and to think about our ongoing commitment to move this work forward. You know, what I'm expressly concerned about is the lasting impact this will have on learning loss for communities of color, and what that will mean long-term for our enrollment as we think about access to higher education and the tools needed to further develop education. So I think it requires us to, in an ongoing way, think about how we resource communities, have engagement and communication with communities, and think about how we invest our resources, not just when it's evident like now, but to be proactive in building that relationship. We have community engagement centers in communities here at the University of Pittsburgh, and I think it's a priority for us to amplify that work and continue to advance it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the way that you posed the question, Kai, I mean, in some ways, the pandemic, and I would add a third, I mean, you've got COVID, you've got the racial reckoning, and then you've actually got income inequality, which shows up for a lot of us in the families that we're students we're serving, and a kind of loss of jobs and income and things. So in many ways, this particular moment has just shined a light, if you will, on those inequities in a way that, as I think if our community at least has motivated our community to respond and to think about, in so many ways, some of our equity work has been given even more urgency at this point now, because we have a clearer understanding. I mean, we knew in theory, and we knew certainly in personal anecdotes and things about the experiences of our students, but now here we see it so much more clearly, and we come to it now with an even deeper sense of urgency around how to respond. And that isn't just on campus, that's actually out in the community. It's why the work that I mentioned earlier is so critical, because we live in an immigrant neighborhood, and so, for example, the COVID has raged through this neighborhood. So, we've had to think, but here we are as trying to keep our students safe and the like, and yet we're surrounded by the pandemic really raging. And how do we not just pull back in, be able to get out and actually be neighbor, if you will, support the food insecurity challenges, some of the challenges that we've got, some anti-vax, kind of threads that run through this neighborhood. And so all of that becomes important, that we can actually be engaged in that work, in an appropriate way. Not that we're coming in, with solutions to every problem, but that we are walking alongside of our neighbors in their experience of this pandemic. And so I think that's, in many ways, I hope that we won't go back to, in fact, I'm sure we're not going to go back to whatever was normal. We're going to actually now see this work as we come out of this as an opportunity to make this even more central to our work going forward.
As I feared, we're getting way more questions we can answer. So I'm just going to tell everybody, I'll stick around afterwards. I know many people can't, but I'll stick around as long as I can, but I'm trying to prioritize. So here's a question. We have a couple of folks who've joined us from very small institutions, and they don't have currently someone designated as a chief diversity officer. Again, I've told you both, NAPAHE and NADAHE is often about leading from where you are. What can we recommend to colleagues who may not have the structure that some other institutions have to carry the work forward?
Yeah, I think that's a question that I think comes to us often in NADAHE. Certainly, we're going to advocate for the creation of those roles. And we think that it signifies a commitment to the work overall. But I think it's being willing to start somewhere and to say how you prioritize moving the strategy forward. I think part of it is being willing to, at the highest level, work with presidents and to boards, and to say that this is an imperative, but to identify who those champions are in the community that can form a group to start moving that work forward. So if you obviously don't have that point of contact, you nonetheless have individuals who are part of the community that want to invest time, effort, and attention in this work, and to convene them together to help move the needle, if you will, or to start the strategy and what the priority areas are for that institution, I think is a good place to start.
I agree completely, and just our own personal experience here. So Joanne, we did not have a chief diversity officer back in 2008, 2009. I tapped Joanne, who was our director of student activities and orientation, who certainly cared about these issues, but she started in a very small way and built the job, and just now in the past year has moved into the vice president's role, and that, she's accompanied that journey, but it didn't start with, again, going out and hiring somebody new. It was really from within that we were able to bring her gifts and talents to bear on behalf. And the truth is that served us very well because she's so well trusted. She knows the community well, and as she's grown into the role, on some of the tough questions that folks in these roles have to address, on bias and discrimination. She's got a trustworthy kind of relationships across the campus that really makes her even more effective, I would say.
I think that's something I want to highlight just quickly, Kai. I think that's important. I think having that conduit to the community is a critical pillar in moving this work forward. But understanding, as we think about our roles in building rapport and relationship with our presidents, and we think about that connection, it's encouraging them also to be visible and to be a part of those conversations and to have that same connection to the community as well. And in situations where that might not be present, to step outside your comfort zone and be willing to acknowledge that you have work to do.
Thank you. I'm going to try to get one more in before my colleague Brittany wraps things up. A former chair of NAPAHE, my good friend Catherine Enck at College of St. Benedict, has a great question for those of us who are PAs. How do we balance the long timeline of change in higher education with the urgent expectations of our students? Some of us, well, I'll say me, have been at our joints for a long time. And I can say, man, it's so much healthier now than it was, even though we have a long way, light years to go to get even healthier. But how do we balance that with our students who come to us, sometimes confidentially, to express their concerns? I mean, how do we do that?
I think it's being willing to acknowledge the fierce urgency and now in those students. And for them, their experience is the finite time they have with us. So being willing to try to listen to their perspective and make the amendments that we can. Certainly, we know that this is a marathon, but there are some actions that I think as institutions we have to take that require immediate action. So being willing to, as our colleagues who wrote the book, Equity Walk, talk about, speak truth to power, and to do so in such a way that you're honest to the perspectives that come from our students and be willing to be their mouthpiece or their voice.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think this is it's a remarkable moment. I mean, I'm a 64-year-old white guy who has the privilege to lead this kind of remarkable institution, and I'm listening to our students every day, and I'm listening both to their aspirations, but also to the historic trauma that they bear. And for me, it's a moral commitment that we as an institution lift up this work. But interestingly enough, our new critical race and ethnic studies program, which will be established next fall, was actually a request of a group of students to the administration in 1968. So think about that. So I'm responding to a 53-year-old, and let me tell you, we are making that point. We are taking responsibility for the fact that this institution did not respond to that request from students, even as we established this very exciting new program. And I think that's just one example of where you've got to be accountable for the fact that maybe over time institutions haven't lived up, haven't always done what our students today expect of us. And so it's a remarkable moment, and I think we're on this side of history. And with everything that's going on in the world, we got a chance to really redefine higher education for the 21st century and beyond around the ways that our student expectations will reshape us. So
I knew it. I knew this hour was going to get away from us. Before I turn it over to Brittany Daubenhire, who is the executive director of NAPAHE, and she's going to tell us that you got to join us on February 11th when Paulette Granberry Russell gives us a charge as a closing plenary as to where we go from here. Please note that in the chat box, you're going to find more information on the breakout sessions if you want that. But Brittany, it's all yours. But before I get, Paul, Clyde, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I speak on behalf, we're getting all kinds of thank yous. Thank you very much. And Brittany, take us home.
Sure. Thank you again to our panelists and to our moderator, Kai. Though NAPI's official name has the word presidential assistant in it, we serve more than just president's assistants. We serve we serve board professionals, we serve chiefs of staffs, provost assistants, vice president's assistants, dean's assistants. In the chat box, I shared a link about our upcoming conference. Today, I ask you to help spread the word about NAPI to other people that work at your institution that NAPI might help serve. In this global pandemic, we are seeking more resources, more support, and more connection. So please be the person that introduces NAPI to those at your institution who might benefit from the resources, support, and connection that our association provides. So thank you for being here with us today. Please join us for a breakout discussion next week, and then come back the following week for our closing plenary. Thank you all so much.
And friends, as I said, I'm going to hang out here for a little bit, but right now these two people have very important things to do. Thank you so much, Clyde. Thank you so much, Paul. I hope I see you soon in person.
Thank you.
Okay, now I'm trying to see, I'm looking in the comments here, and I didn't get to all the questions. I'm so terribly sorry. Oh, Tracy Lindbergh asks, will this be provided as a recording? Yes, my wonderful colleagues at Augustana are going to turn this into a YouTube, and then Brittany will share that on napahi.org and other things like that. I'm looking. I think if you raise a hand or something, I might also be able to, if you have something you'd like to verbally share. But wow, that was great. We had more than 100 colleagues from all over the country with us. You guys made it happen. I'm overwhelmed, very grateful. I'm looking to see if people are raising hands. Okay. Oh, Eleanor asks, when would the recording be available? Well, my colleagues are very generous with their time. I'm assuming it won't take them too long, but please watch. Also, you can also friend. Oh, no, I'm sorry. You can like the Napahi Facebook page. I think it's facebook.com/Napahi, and I think you'll see an alert come out that way. I think. Okay. Oh, how to join Napahi. Yes, thank you so much. You can find out at napahi.org. We would love to have you. And if you have other questions, I forgot to put in here my email address. I'm going to put it in right now. It's just kaiswanson@augustana.edu. And if you have questions that you'd like to hit me directly that way, that's fine. But to the anonymous questioner, go to napahi.org. And it's quite simple to join. Did I get that right, Brittany?
Yes, and I put the link in the chat box.
Always 8 steps ahead of me. Thank you. Okay, we still have a few folks. I'm looking to see if anybody's raising a hand. If I think I can see that if they do.
I will also plan to send the recording out in a follow-up email to all of you that attended, and I will post it on the NAPI website, the news site as well, as soon as it's available.
And just a reminder, folks, that if you didn't have to register to be here. So if you didn't register, we don't know your address. So please send that to me. If you didn't register, you can see my address in there, and just say recording in the subject line, and Brittany we'll make sure that we figure it out. All right. Well, this was really extraordinary. We've still got a few folks joining us, Brittany, but I'm glad you were able to take us home.
Thank you for hosting this phenomenal session. It was fantastic.
Well, everybody played a role, and that was what was so cool about it. All right. And I'm so sorry we didn't get to all the questions. We had some great questions. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any hands raised. Here's a new message. Let's see here. All right, Adiola, I tried to weave your questions in. Thank you very much for your participation. But you had some great questions, and I tried to get those in there, so thank you. All right. Okay. Okay, well, I think for now, I may step aside. I'm actually late for an AGB gig. There's always something else to do, right? But Brittany, thank you for joining us.
Thank
Again,
you. Yes.
if we didn't get to your concern, question, comment, please hit me up at kai.swanson@augustana.edu. And Brittany, I'll be seeing you very soon, I'm sure. Virtually. Bye-bye, all.